Good afternoon from Salatiga. Welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is the second session of our webinar series conducted by the English Language Education Department, Universitas Kristen Satya Wacana. And we are happy to inform you that there were about 1,300 people registered for this webinar, but due to the capacity, we can only accommodate 500 participants. So it is our pleasure to have you all here in our webinar. And the topic for our webinar today is Employable Teacher Professional Identities. This is about the concepts and practices. And before we get started, I would like to go over some technical aspects so you know how to participate in this webinar session. The first one is about question and answer. During this webinar session, you can ask questions and you can type your questions in the Q&A box in your control panel. And the second one is about chat. Of course, as you are doing it now, you can chat with other participants. You can make use of the chat box in your control panel. And the last one is about e-certificate. You will get an e-certificate and you can collect the certificate through the exit poll launched at the end of the webinar session. Okay, now let me introduce the speakers. We'll have two distinguished speakers today. The first one is Dr. Drew Whitworth. He is the Director of Teaching and Learning Strategy at Manchester Institute of Education, University of Manchester. And he gained his PhD from University of Leeds in 2001. And his teaching and research interests lie particularly with distance and online learning and how we learn to make good judgment about information and technology in a digital world. And if you, for example, have shared the same interest as his interest, you can visit his books, for example, Information Obesity, Radical Information Literacy, and Mapping Information Landscapes. And the second distinguished speaker today is Ibu Neni Isharyanti MA. She is a lecturer at Universitas Kristen Satya Wacana and is currently a PhD student at the University of Manchester, where she is researching employable teacher professional identities. She has been a teacher trainer and avid child practitioner at Universitas Kristen Satya Wacana Salatiga for almost 20 years. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please welcome Dr. Drew Whitworth and Ibu Neni Isharyanti.
All right. Has everybody seen my video? Good morning, everyone. Yes, this is morning in Manchester, 10 o'clock, pretty gloomy. Drew pointed out earlier that this is a normal weather, normal summer weather in Manchester. But good afternoon to all of you. And I'm so honored and grateful to be invited here to talk about my research in my PhD research. And I have Drew. Drew is my supervisor here. So let me share the screen. Let's just get started. Right. So yeah, this is the topic for today. We're going to discuss about what is employable teacher professional identities from its concept. And also Drew is going to share some of the practices that he already gained from some of his research. So today, let me see this. We're going to discuss these things. This is the menu for today. First, who are you as a teacher? And what is employability and employability analytical discourse level, and the framework that I offer, and potential conflicts and gaps in the perspective of employable teacher professional identities. In part two, Drew is going to talk about what is practice, what is meant by practice, and what influences the development of professional employable identity, and insights from a research project that he's going to share, and we're going to draw a conclusion. So first of all, apart from being a teacher and apart from being a researcher, I also like art and paintings. And I would like to share with you a painting by Picasso. This is a painting of Marie-Thérèse Walter. I think I found this in Museum of Picasso in Paris. So as you can see, this is a picture of a woman. But in this, if this is a teacher, there are so many different perspectives here. You can see the eyes, for example. One of the eyes actually looking forward. The other eyes are actually looking at the right. And there are so many different components in this picture. And this, I think, can represent somebody as a teacher. There are so many different perspectives of how to see a teacher. And that is why I like this picture, because this represents something that is not very straightforward. And you even can have some opinion about it. This is ugly, or this is beautiful, this is complicated. So when we talk about employable teacher professional identities, let's talk about employability. Now, this is something that I found difficult to translate into Indonesian language, because we don't really have a translation. We don't really have the word employability in Indonesian language. But basically, according to some of the literature in employability is about getting a job and keeping a job. So there are quite a number of research in employability that discuss what is employability. And employability is as simple as about getting a job. It can be how you get a job. It can be keeping a job. But the more I read about employability, I can say that it's not that simple. You know, getting a job is not something that is simple. Keeping a job is not something simple. And probably this resonates more in this era of pandemic, because now getting a job and keeping a job becomes a little bit complicated. What makes you good for a job? What makes an employer decide to give you a job? How do you compete with other people in your job to maintain or keep your job? So it's not that simple. Now, research in employability shed some light in the matter of employability and offers some concepts of what is meant to be employable. Okay, in order to be employable, you can see it as a product. You can also see employability as a process. So as a product, employability is to be recognized as having suitable qualities for a job. If you are a teacher, then how do your employers think of you, whether you actually deserve to be a teacher or not? But at the same time, employability is also a process. It's a process of developing some qualities that will be suitable for a job. So it's not very straightforward. Employability is not that straightforward. Now, when we look at the history of research in employability, there are 3 employability analytical discourse levels. So employability can be discussed from the perspective of 3 different levels. We have macro discourse level, we have meso discourse level, and we have micro discourse level. In the case of a teacher, when we talk about macro discourse level, the government and the National Association of Profession is the one who voice their perspective in here. So you can see, for example, when the government is trying to work on Kartu Prakerja, for example, in Indonesia, if you want to be employed, you can actually increase your capacity by doing several trainings provided by the government through different organizations so that you are recognized as somebody who is employable. The government also, some government, and this is not only happening in Indonesia, some government also sets standards. If you want to be employed as a teacher, these are the standards that you must have. You must be A, B, C, D, E. In a meso discourse level, this is the level where the organizations taking part or doing something about employability. For example, HE stands for higher education. There are certain standards that the government impose, and the higher education then respond to this by making sure that their students actually meeting the standards. In my research, the reaction of higher education to Indonesian Qualification Framework, or KKNI, is actually responded by the higher education by creating curriculum that is based on IQF or KKNI. So this is the discourse in the MISO level. Also, when we talk about MISO discourse level, we also talk about employers. Certain employers is actually very powerful in setting up what kind of employee that they want. So they usually, when they accept a potential employee, they will set certain standards. Okay, you have to meet A, B, C. We can see this from a job advertisement, for example, where certain employers actually set up what they want. There is also association of workers, professional association, because certain profession have association, and this association also have voice in deciding what kind of qualities that actually are expected from certain individuals when they want to be something, when they want to be in a profession. In the micro discourse level, there's also the individual process, I should call it, because when you are a person and you want to become a teacher, for example, you will develop the qualities that you think is important or you think is relevant of being a teacher. It will increase your chances of getting a job or maintaining a job. There is a trend, for example, in this pandemic that some institutions and some individuals are trying to improve and develop their professionalism by going through some webinars or some workshop about remote learning, for example, and remote teaching. And this webinar is, if you are the participants in this webinar, probably one of the reasons you join this webinar is because you want to get a certificate that actually make you recognize that you are actually having certain knowledge or having certain training in employable teacher professional identities, for example. So when we talk about employability, we also talk about the different discourses or perspective in different levels when we're dealing with the idea of getting and keeping a job. So this is a framework that I developed in my PhD research. It's called Employable Teacher Professional Identities. And the framework is like this. This is the visualization of the framework. So we have on the left the employability analytical level. Let me have a pointer. So we have the employability analytical level, and we have already discussed the different level, the macro level, the meso level, and the micro level. And we also have discussed the stakeholders. So in the macro level, we have the government and National Association of Teachers. In meso level, we have higher education and employer, and usually this is in the form of school. This whole thing represent the contextual factors that that influence the identities of teacher, the professional identities of teacher. In the micro level, we have individual qualities. So this is what a teacher at different career stage develop. So for example, a teacher, when they're still a pre-service teacher, they develop certain individual qualities that makes them feel that they are a professional teacher. In the stage where they are as newly qualified teacher, they also develop probably a slight different professional identities, and so on and so forth. So there is a recognition of the contextual factor when you are developing your employable teacher professional identities. because there are the discourses of different stakeholders, but also there is an individual feature in employable teacher professional identities, because this is an individual process that is sometimes very personal. And there is also a temporality there, because in different stage of career, a teacher might have slightly different set of qualities that is relevant or important for that certain stage of career. So this is the framework that I am using in my PhD research. Now, when we have different perspective of employable teacher professional identities, there is a potential that this will bring conflicts or gaps of perspective. I have already established through this presentation that you can see employable teacher professional identities as a product. This is a set of qualities that is static, that is like a checklist, that is like a categories and standards in macro and meso level. When you're talking about government regulation, for example, in standardizing teacher professional identities, you have, for example, different competencies that every teacher must meet: pedagogical competences, social competences, attitude competences. The KKNI, or Indonesian Qualification Framework, has a certain set of statement that if you are a graduate of teacher education program level 6, you have to be A, B, C. You have to be able to cooperate. You have to know certain knowledge. You have to have certain working abilities. So when we see employable teacher professional identities in macro and meso discourse level, it is seen as a product that is static, that is a checklist. So in order to be recognized by the government, by the National Association of Teachers, by schools, by higher education, you have to be able to display or to perform this list of qualities under these categories, and you have to meet the standards. So it's pretty much something that is divided into different categories of competencies rather than something that is seen as a process. Well, on the contrary, when we're talking in a micro discourse level, in an individual level, the development of teacher professional identities is very dynamic because it can change over time. When you first graduate, when you first doing your teaching practicum, you might have a different set of qualities from the one that you actually have now after you're teaching professionally for a number of years. We also realize as a person that your professional identities are multifaceted. It's not something that you can compartmentalize into statements. We find in the course of our professional life as a student, for example, that one teacher might not be very, very intelligent in the field, but he or she can be very good in managing the classroom. But that doesn't make that he or she is not a good teacher. And also we have to recognize that teacher professional identities must be seen as a whole, as a holistic concept. Because again, just because you don't meet every single statement in the standards of acceptable teacher or professional teacher, it makes you a bad teacher. Also, when there's a recognition that this is a process, there is a recognition also that as a person, a teacher has the agency or has the power to decide which qualities that he or she considers to be more relevant or important in certain stage of his or her career. And also, whatever is considered to be important or relevant for an individual teacher Sometimes it's being influenced by contextual factor. One of the interesting finding in my research so far is when the my study program, think that the ability to use technology in classroom is very important, and thus a student teacher must think that he or she must develop or perform the ability to use technology. The school or the employer of the student teacher actually didn't share the same perspective, because the school, the mentor particularly, thought that the use of technology in classroom can be disruptive for the students. So this leaves the student teacher actually in a situation where she has to decide which contextual factor that she would like to hear, whether she had to listen to her teaching practicum supervisor from the higher education, or did she have to follow the mentor teacher at the school. There is actually a personal process, a dynamic process of negotiating which identities or which qualities that actually more relevant or more important in keeping the job or in getting the job. So we can see that there is a potential of conflicts or gaps in the perspective. And next time I will pass the microphone to Drew with his part. So Drew, this is your chance to talk about what is practice.
Give me a minute, everybody. Okay, first of all, hello, can you hear me? I hope you can all hear me. I will start my slides in a moment. Yes, okay, thank you, Nelly. But I will start my slides in a moment. But I'm happy to be here in Yorkshire talking in Indonesia. I was in Indonesia in November. Nenny finds it very amusing to mention to you that while I was there, I went to an Indonesian football match, and it was PSIS Semarang against Makassar, and Semarang won 1-0. I mention this only because, of course, I realize now I'm talking to 500 people, and of course none of you are here. So here are my fans in the stand. There you go. My wife's collection of Russian dolls is the main audience for this. Now I will start my slides, my part of the slides, and then right, I'm hoping that's all okay for you and you can now see me in the corner and see my slides. So, yes, Nenny has talked about the theoretical and conceptual aspects of her work and this idea that we can explain employability and this notion of competence, this notion of being a competent professional, in this case in the teaching profession. That there are different definitions of competency, that they play out differently at the levels of government, at the levels of the institution, the university in this case, and school, and at the level of the individual. And she's talked about this in theory, and it's my job now to talk about the practice, to talk about some of the things that I've seen down the years in my research. I will show you towards the end of my section of this presentation, I will show you some quotes from students who have been talking about the ways in which they develop notions of identity and competence, but we'll come back to that. But I will talk about the links between theory and practice at this stage, because it's how these things play out in practical settings that has been the focus of my research down the years, and is very much now a way of elaborating and exploring this consequences of this framework that, you know, Nenny has put together. But in order to do so, let's start with this question: what actually is practice? Because we use, at least in English, you know, this phrase, oh, that's fine in theory, but in practice, it wouldn't work. That we can say theory and practice theory explains things, but practice is what we actually do. Okay, practice is what we do. And when we get together and do things in a professional situation, in an organization, in a classroom, the practice that I'm engaging in now, this practice of giving a webinar, and it's a matter of me talking to a computer, but in order to make this intelligible, in order that we can all understand what is going on here, we understand that this is a kind of teaching situation, that there are various technologies in play here, and that in order to organize this webinar, the various organizations have come into play, the UKSW most obviously, but also, the organizations that have created the software, that have allowed me and Nenny to meet in the first place, for Nenny to do her studies at the University of Manchester. And all of these other organizational practices intertwine to create this whole idea of a university or a school or, a government ministry in the first place. People can leave organizations, they can leave the school, they can leave the university, they can leave the ministry, but the job still exists. The practices that teacher or minister or academic, or indeed that lawyer or that doctor or that nurse, all of the different professional roles that we fulfill are a matter of the practices that we engage in order to fulfill them. Yes, organizations will lose something if a particular person leaves it. They will lose their friendship networks. You will lose the specific knowledge and skills of that individual. So organizations are partly people. Something like a school is partly the teachers and indeed the pupils and the managers and the administrators. But it is also partly the practices. Practices can be sustained. They can be passed on from person to person. And therefore, practices form a kind of collective understanding of how you do things in a particular situation and what technologies exist to help you do that, what procedures exist. This is the idea of the practice architecture, that we practice our jobs and indeed our personal lives as well, but let's stick to our professional lives at the moment. We practice our jobs in architectures that have been set up in order to make it easier to do certain things. There are certain practices that fit within the architecture of the university in ways that others don't. Just as, a bathroom, for example, is a great place to get clean and, relax in a bath, but not a great place to sleep, for example. The architecture is wrong for the practice of sleeping. It's great for the practice of cleaning and, putting on makeup and so on, but it's, bad for sleeping. And it's the same with an organization. An organization like a university makes certain practices like teaching, very effective, whereas other practices like, rapidly producing new software products, universities are not great at that, but they're not set up to do that kind of thing. Their architecture is wrong. So with Nenny having spoken about how this architecture of practice in the university is a way of structuring and indeed communicating our understanding of what an effective graduate of that university should be. people moving through university engage with the practices of that university, and they do so in ways that they hope will, at the end of the day, see them pass their course. Who would enroll on any course at a university in the belief that they will fail it? So the practices of the university are set up in ways that make teaching effective and also make the outcomes of that teaching, in other words, the students' learning, measurable. And it's this point about measurability. You know, how do we define competence in this case, the developing teacher training program, that becomes key, I guess, to the points that I'm trying to make in this part of the presentation. Now, look, these ideas in general, they are not mine. A whole load of relevant theorists have written about it that I've just been building on down the years. I mean, I could name many, but let's mention just a few. Etienne Wenger and his idea of the community of practice, the idea that, you know, practice is something that is shared. People learn together how to do their jobs, and they share these learning needs in this notion of the community of practice. The community of practice builds around it what Wenger, with other authors, Wenger, White and Smith, have called digital habitats. The idea that, you know, like we're doing now, we are meeting and talking as a group, but we are depending on certain technological spaces and technological practices to make this work. Wenger recognizes that groups build around them communicative spaces. They use technologies in particular ways and decide amongst themselves what constitutes competent use of these technologies in this case. Hold these ideas in mind, because I will return to them. The general idea of practice theory, I mean, there are other authors like Bourdieu, Pierre Bourdieu, who has written about this as well, but I'm most familiar with the idea of this gentleman, Theodore Shatsky, and particularly because I was introduced to this through this author, Anne-Marie Lloyd, who looked at the way that information and information literacy, the ability to take informed judgments and to use information in ways appropriate to a professional context, is something that you have to learn in the context. Lloyd developed these ideas first in her PhD study, which she did in around 2004, I think, roughly. She looked at the information practices of firefighters. And if you think about it, firefighting as a profession, which it is, you know, it's something you learn to do and you learn to do well. I couldn't fight a fire right now. Well, I'd give it a go, but I wouldn't be very good at it. Firefighters, in a professional sense, of course, they have some very important information needs. Every time they go into their professional setting, their information needs are very immediate, and they constitute things like, where are the people? Can I get them out safely? Is this roof going to fall on my head? Is it too safe? Can I breathe? And so on. You know, you don't fulfill these information needs by downloading stuff off Wikipedia or Facebook. You know, what Lloyd recognized was that these information needs were fulfilled by these firefighters by their observations of more experienced colleagues in the setting, which is true of teachers and nurses and doctors to some extent, I am sure. That's why we have mentors. But of course, you know, the type of information that you require as a teacher is very different from the type of information you require as a firefighter, and indeed as a lawyer and a nurse and an academic. So, you know, we learn to handle information in particular settings with, and influenced by the practice architectures that help us form knowledge in this setting. And although Lloyd's ideas are not particularly focused on education and, you know, how we teach people to do this, these are the focus of the works of another author who, like Lloyd, is Australian, Christine Bruce. And her idea of informed learning, the idea that, you know, in a higher education setting, when we are teaching people to become teachers, when we are teaching them, as I do, to become educational technologists. I work on a degree, an MA degree in Manchester called the MA Digital Technologies, Communication and Education. So if you want to check it out, it's a distance learning program as well as an on-campus program. It might be convenient for the coming year. But this is what we are trying to do on our program, is to develop people's abilities to make good judgments about educational technology, to understand the impact that particular technologies have on the teaching and learning process, to understand the ways in which technologies impact upon people's interactions with information. And, for us, competence, professional competence in this field is the ability to make good judgments about educational technology, just as professional competence in the field of, the UKSW's education program is defined around different competencies, those connected more directly with teaching in schools, as Nenny has explained. So, the idea of informed learning and the idea of information literacy as a practice suggests that as a teacher, as a teacher on this postgraduate program, I need to develop my students' ability to make these good judgments about information and to use technology effectively. But, coming now to my own take on this, I have tried in my works to look at the ways in which we can do this in a kind of democratic way, to distribute authority over information. I'm teaching people to be professionals. I don't want them to look at me as somebody who tells them what to think. I want to teach them how to think, which is a different thing entirely. I don't want to tell them what to think. I want to help them develop their own abilities to make their own judgments. And this requires them to adopt a certain authority over their ideas about what competence is. And this is where it starts to really become important for employability, having spent at least 15 minutes there on my introduction. But these ideas, these theories, connect up very much at this point with what Nenny has started talking about here. Because these definitions of competence, these different ideas about what competence is, are important. If you're a student on a master's program, hopefully you're seeing this picture of some of my students from, at least a couple of years ago. These students, they are studying at Manchester in order that they can become competent professional educational technologists at one level. But they're also very keen to pass the course, and that's a different thing for them, to some extent for the university. The ways in which they perform their practice, the ways in which they use their work and display the sense of who they are and who they are becoming while they are studying at the university is by no means necessarily the same as the ways in which they need to display competence or will need to display competence when they move into a professional setting. They know full well, and it's, a factor of the way that the university practice architecture is set up, is that competence is measured at that in the ways that the macro and meso levels that Nenny has already described measure these kinds of things. They grade it. Far too much, if you ask me, we are still in universities using academic essays as like the only measure of knowledge. And it's for me, such a limiting way of doing it, because it measures your ability to write an essay, sure, but it doesn't measure your ability to practice and make judgments like a professional, not in full. In any case, either way, regardless of whether you've got a much more sophisticated assessment system than that, and I hope that I do anyway on my courses, but either way, the award of the qualification indicates that the university believe you've reached some kind of level of competence, but not that is inevitably always going to be a different thing, at least slightly, from the idea that you can then go off and apply that knowledge in a practical setting. You're a teacher, this is what Nenny's been talking about, or you want to be an educational technologist like the people I teach. You've got to be able to feel competent and confident. There are many aspects of the job that are not measured by whether you know the theory of teaching or your disciplinary knowledge. Nenny, you didn't say this, you didn't report on this example in your own earlier bit of the talk, but I always found it highly amusing that one of your interviewees said, said the worst thing about being a teacher in practice, she said, the thing that put me off was when the kids were sick, and she had to clean it up. And you have grumpy children like the one I found this picture of here, the demanding, grumpy child. I don't think I could be a teacher for that reason. I want to deal with children particularly, and I certainly don't want to clean up, sick. I may well know the theory of teaching. I may well know the practice of teaching, but that doesn't mean that there aren't many aspects of what it means to be a competent teacher that you just have to learn on the job, that your identity as a developing professional, must keep developing. It cannot fully develop in the higher education setting. And how you get experience of these other parts of any kind of job, it's a much more personal, subjective thing. Never will be measurable in these formal assessments of competence, things like that government standards or the university measuring whether you can write an essay. These things are so hard to measure. They've just got to be something that you feel, and you develop them in combination with other people, and it's important, that we remember that we study university as members of groups, particularly at the moment where we're all separated in our homes. But knowledge and identity and professionalism and these ideas of competence, these ideas of good practice in a particular professional situation are very much developed collaboratively. And we do this in association with other people. We look to them for examples of how to act. And we measure our levels of job satisfaction often with reference to what other people think about us. It's important that we as academics get now and again to talk to people even like this, because it's a validation of our ideas, it's a validation of our sense of who we are as a developing professional. And these things are, if not impossible to measure and assess at university, they are at least much more elusive and nebulous, but they're still important. I just want to spend like the last 10 minutes, because I said, organised I would do half an hour's talking, and that would take us up to about 5 to 11 here in the UK. But just in these last minute, I do want to give you some insight into how students actually talk about and organise the practices of study in ways that display their competence and ways in which assessment at a university could possibly be set up in ways in order to help facilitate this. This SPIDER study, this is an acronym for Stewarding and Power in Digital Educational Resources, and it was a project that's still ongoing really, because we're still going into the data, but what we had, this is my colleague Lee Webster, and I credit very much to Lee, whose idea this was originally, and we've worked together on it since. But Lee and I have been doing work with records of discussions that small groups of students on the MA that I run. So when you hear references here to the tutor, I am the tutor as well as the researcher on this project. But yes, on our MA DTCE, Digital Technologies, Communication and Education. It's a year-long course for full-time students, 2 years part-time. And over that academic year, or in fact over 2 academic years, we studied the interactions that these students were engaging in on the online discussion boards that they were using on my course unit. Some of my students and some of the MA students are distance learners, as I've said, so when they work together in small groups with students either elsewhere in the world or in Manchester, they can't meet by the coffee machine or, go out to dinner or, sit in the library. They need to use some kind of online tool to work together, and we were able to get access to the records of the discussions that they had online. So as on my course unit, they are asked to work together and collaborate on complex tasks. This gives us the chance to investigate how they actually talk to each other and how they can be seen, for the purposes of this presentation, how they can be seen developing their identity as competent practitioners. How do they draw on the authority of the institution to govern their practice, the university, and how do they work together with other members of their group to fit their practice into their shared needs to pass this course? But how are they also developing skills that they can hopefully take forward into the professional setting? Because this is, key for any program in higher education. How do you not just help people pass the course, but how do you help them develop the skills they need to transfer their knowledge into the professional setting? This is, as I've said, already what we're trying to do. So our study from which these ideas are now being drawn are, that's the study that we undertook. So let's think first about this question of authority over practice. I'm going to quote myself there from my new book, Mapping Information Landscapes, which is just about to be published. It's going to be published next week. But yeah, practice is a locus of authority, and at a particular place and time shapes judgments about what is considered relevant. The students, most of all, we saw them considering that things were relevant if it accorded with their view of what I, as the tutor, saw as important in this setting. Because I'm assessing them, I'm giving them a mark. And as I said, nobody enrolls on a course of higher education study, expensive as they are, in order to fail it. So, they want to get that mark. They want to pass the course. And as a proxy for the University of Manchester and the person who decides whether they're competent enough to pass the course. So students are very keen to know what I think is the way that they should do this. But that's what I meant earlier about this notion that I don't want them just to see me as a source of what to think. I want to teach them how to think. So they've got to, as far as I'm concerned, they have to also grow beyond this sense that they must accord with the authority of the tutor and develop their own sense of what is good practice. And to do this, the authority must be distributed. They must develop a micro level view of themselves as competent and not just think that as they've passed the checklist and passed the course that they're competent. Hopefully you see what I mean here, because this is why the micro level is important. If I'm going to turn these people into competent professionals who can go off into an educational environment and work well, they need to be able to make their own judgments. So they need to have developed a certain sense of themselves as authoritative. And let's think about how they do this. Because students see this in the first place, these discussion boards and the arena in which they are being surveilled, that in Nenny's case, the teaching setting as well, the place in which they know that their mentor is assessing them. And they are trying to perform their identity as professionals, as developing professionals, in ways that are going to get them the best mark. They're very aware, in the case of my case study, that their contributions to these discussion boards were being assessed, and they were very careful about what they said on these boards. Every group had a private space. This is obvious from the data and from interviews that my colleague Lee conducted with these students. Every group had a private space. They would set up a Facebook group or a WhatsApp chat. Tutors were not, we were not invited to these. They would organize online meetings, and they would put minutes of the meetings on the board, which was good information practice. But, that didn't mean that the content of these meetings was being assessed by me, the tutor. I looked at what was on the discussion board. And groups were very sure that they had a private space in which they could engage in practice that was not being monitored all the time. And, you know, the smiley. In one of the interviews, Lee was told by a student, she said, look, she said on the boards, every time I put a smiley like that, what it really meant was, I really don't like this other student, but I'm not going to say anything because I don't want the boards to, you know, have disagreement and conflict. You know, they were very careful to avoid conflict on the boards. They didn't see this as a competent practice that they should be displaying. But this student, you know, really didn't like one of her colleagues and said, look, for the sake of not having an argument, I'll just put a little smiley and it means I'm ignoring you and I don't like you. You know, there's a lot to be said about, however, the reason that surveillance could be something that students were doing for themselves and on the basis of, you know, having records of these judgments allowed them to be scrutinized and reflected upon later. So, you know, this is different from doing group work in a university setting where there's no record of the group work. Every time I do talk about this, someone always says at one point, well, I would never do group work because students will hate it because they complain about free riders and there's always this guy who doesn't do the work and if he's going to get the mark, then that's unfair. But here, I don't get any complaints like that because everybody can see people's practices. You know, the practices are recorded. If a person hasn't contributed to the discussion, it's obvious. And yeah, I don't give them marks that were as good as the rest of the group, and the group knows this. So, you know, the visibility of these practices is in this case something that also allows the students to reflect upon them and learn from them and work together as a group. You know, I don't tend to get arguments about people not contributing because it's clear that if somebody's not contributing, that's their problem, and the rest of the group tends to just get on with it, which is interesting. Not to do with employability as such, but it's still interesting. Nevertheless, what you are seeing and what we do see in the data, which I will just run through now, five more minutes on my bit, are ways in which students do develop this kind of identity as authoritative professionals. And there's three ways in which I'm going to just look at quotes from the data and show you how they did this. They're listed on that slide. Now, I know, again, for those of you looking at a mobile phone, this is going to be rather squashed. And it's, I will just say that the final and useful point is the one in the last sentence of this quote, starting about sort of towards the center also. What is happening here? This is a student who is trying to say to the rest of her group that competent practice in this specific moment in time where they're trying to put together, they've got to, I'm asking them to apply theory to practice. I need them to discuss on the discussion boards designs for a technological intervention in an environment, which happens to be a museum, in fact. But I want them, and I've written in their assessment specification, I have written down the words that are there, bold and italic. I say rather in the assessment specification, those exact words. Everyone in this group should apply frameworks and theories which were introduced in the course and use your field notes from the museums. Nenny knows that I'm notorious, by the way, for very, very long and complicated assessment specifications, but these are documents from the MISO level. You know, the assessment specification is a clear indication of what's considered competent in this setting. I tell them what I'm going to give them marks for. So there is no, you know, there's no concealing it. There's no doubt about it. I say very clearly, competency in this setting, good marks, do this, 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 and this, and this, and you'll get them. This student is citing this document to her colleagues as a way of saying, I think that, you know, the student from the purple group thinks that they should apply frameworks and theories introduced in the course and use their field notes. It's not me saying this directly. It's this student saying this and saying to the rest of the group that she thinks competent practice involves fitting in with the assessment specification. So she's citing me, excuse me, she's citing me. I am a proxy tutor. Sorry, she has become this proxy tutor, citing what she sees as authoritative advice to help the rest of the group do things in a competent way because they all want to pass the course. You know what I mean? So it was very interesting to see this happen a lot. This was by no means the only example of this. Lots of students said, Drew says this. I think that Drew wants us to do this. Drew wants us to do this. Okay? Using me and what, suggesting to the rest of the group how they reorient their practice in order to fit in with the assessment specification is interesting that they took on that authoritative role. Students would invoke their own professional experience. Many of my part-time students are already teachers of some kind, and you see here two examples, A and B, of students who are just saying that, look, in my professional practice, I do this, I use this technology. The guy at the bottom, student B, who introduced Padlet to the course, I mean, this caused a sensation. Everybody suddenly picked up Padlet after Ben, I think he was called, after Ben suggested it to the rest of the group. Suddenly Padlet was the big technology that year, and I'm still using it. And an example of where students can introduce practices from their professional setting into the university practice architecture. And Ben very much drew on his own professional experience and an understanding and use of this technology, justified its use to his group, that spread out of that group into the cohort as a whole and into my practice as a teacher and as a designer of learning environments. So, an interesting example there of, authority flowing up from the micro level into the meso level. Certainly was visible in this case. And again, there's a lot of text on that screen, I know, and without context it might not make a lot of sense, but what you have here is an example of a student who is modeling good information practice to the rest of her group. This idea of the community of practice and then the digital habitat that I mentioned about half an hour ago from Wenger's ideas. Good practice in a professional setting, good informational practice in a professional setting involves organizing the information that is important to your team, to your professional group, in ways that make it easy for you to engage in your project. Now, I'm involved in various projects with colleagues, as is normal for someone in my profession, and I need to know where my information is. I need to organize my time. I need to, have different email folders and different folders on my Mac, and so on. And this student is saying exactly the same thing to her group. She's saying, look, I've typed up my field notes. I've organized different threads on the Blackboard discussion boards. She's explained what information she's providing to the rest of the group and says, look, I think it's likely we'll need a bit of back and forth. She's planning, she's organizing. She's not just talking about disciplinary knowledge and skills. She's organizing the work of her colleagues and taking on the role of a moderator for the group in ways that, I started off doing this in this series of tasks, but by this stage, and that must be activity 3 because she's talking about field notes, by the end of this final activity, this student is confident and competent enough to start to be organizing the work of the rest of her group in ways that she would do in the professional setting. And I think, the data are revealing of the ways in which you can develop this sense of practice in the university setting in ways that transfer into the professional, as long as you think about how to design your learning environments in these ways. Look, this is in effect in my last slide, and again, all a bit squashed. But what I'm saying here, is quoting myself, what I'm saying here is in the end that we need to make, when you're looking at how somebody like a teacher, a trainee teacher, or a mentor, or an academic, or indeed in any professional setting, the judgments that individuals and groups make in practice must be looked at with reference to these broader properties of the social setting. This is what Nenny was saying earlier. You know, the broader currents of discourse, these ideas of what does it mean to be competent? What does it mean to be effective? What does it mean to be qualified? And, you know, in a very even broader sense, international trends in terms of, you know, how we measure it. That was me done, by the way. So I don't know how we're going to work the rest of this now. Nenny, did you want to conclude for us? Is Nenny still here? Yes, hello, Nenny. Okay,
I just got like 5 minutes of cutoff. I don't know why.
Well, I just lost for a second. I'm hoping everybody got that, but I'm. Should I stop my video or should I keep it going, or are you going to? You want to come on?
I think it's the moderator time. Debbie's time.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's have Debbie.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Drew and Ibu Nenny, for the very inspiring talk. And now let's proceed to the question and answer session. But before that, while preparing your questions, I'd like to announce one thing, that is the exit poll. The exit poll will be launched in a few minutes, so you can collect your e-certificate there. So make sure that you will collect your certificate by completing the exit ticket. Okay, I see here some or quite many questions coming in, but I think some of them have been answered by Bu Nenny. And let me pick one question here from, wait.
Well, Debbie, I've just been reading up the Q&A, if that's all right. And I mean, I know some of them have been answered, but shall I?
Okay, do you want to pick one question?
Well, I was looking at Sean Patrick Kang.
Okay, it's okay.
Question.
Time is yours, Drew.
Sean,
Yeah, can you please show your video?
System gives equity towards student professional development, not to just evaluate or monitor their progress, but to empower them. Many people argue that grading with numbers seems to not represent the whole assessment of a person. Furthermore, it might impact their feelings of being incompetent or all that jazz. Look, Sean, Patrick, that's a great question. That's a great question. And I completely agree with you. I do not like giving numbers to people in any way. I find them completely arbitrary. And I wish in a way I didn't have to do it. On the other hand, I do think that, you know, there's some kind of, I think we do need some kind of way of comparing people's different abilities. And I do think that it is reasonable to recognize the sense of grading, with the proviso that you're right, that it is of course a big issue about confidence. I mean, I remember I was pretty much a bit of a swot at university. That's why I'm an academic now. And I remember getting a 55 once in one of my course units, and it was like devastating for me, you know. Of course, what I should have seen it as is a way of saying, oh, well, maybe this time you got a little overconfident and you didn't read the assessment specification correctly, and so on. I mean, there's a lot of work being done now with the design of digitalized learning environments in ways that allow the capture of a much more nuanced and broad range of qualities than can just be captured in an essay. And the kinds of interactions that my students have been having, you know, new generation of digital learning environments, and you know, talking here about environments like, or at least equivalent to things like Microsoft Teams, for instance, and Slack, you know, these kinds of workflow management tools. You know, there are ways in which you can use these to monitor student behavior in a much more holistic way, and, you know, give that feedback back to students in real time, you know, so as rather than it being seen as something that all gets summed up in a grade and not until the end of the course, by which time it's too late to do anything about it, you know, the sort of latest generation of digital learning environments that allow you to, you know, capture and rework the environment in real time to help people, you know, develop these feelings of being competent because they recognize how much better their work is getting as they progress through the course. I mean, many of my students start off in activity 1 going, well, I don't understand what I'm being asked to do here, and yet nevertheless by the end of activity 3 are really confident. So I can see this developing, and you know, I would like to use this assessment process to develop my students' confidence. But I do agree that the idea of summing it all up in a number at the end of a course is not, you know, the kind of way to go about it. You know, better, what we really need is plenty of formative feedback, as well as, you know, just that number at the end. But it is interesting, you know, that this kind of practice and competency developing work is much easier to do. You know, it's becoming easier to do and to organize with these kinds of workflow management tools like Slack. Nelly, I mean, I don't know if you want to add anything to this, or whether you've been answering questions as I've been going, really, or I will hand back to Debbie.
Yeah, how about you, Nelly? Do you have anything else to add, or you want to answer different questions?
I don't have anything to add to Drew. I think it's frustrating, really. I think I've seen in the question and answer, there are some frustrating questions that, yes, teachers are feeling confidence about their own micro level progress in teacher development, but at the same time, there are other forces of nature, so to speak. Like I think Drew has already concluded very eloquently, I should say, Drew, that as much as there is an individual factor there, there are other forces like the government standards, like the schools. Some of the questions that I found in question and answer, for example, asking about, so what should we do as a teacher to meet the government standards that are not holistic, that are very checklist. And then there's a question about, okay, what can we do as an employer if there are this teacher with this qualification? How do we do? Like, I think at one point in writing my dissertation, my research result, I put like, there are so many bosses to serve. When you are a teacher, you realize that there are so many bosses to serve. You have to serve your students, you have to serve the school administration, you have to serve the government. And it's very frustrating at times. What I can say is, and I'm a firm believer in this, that as a teacher, you do have the power, you do have the knowledge, you do have the authority to decide, to know enough about your learning environment and to decide what's good on your learning environment. And again, as I say, in individual level, teacher professional development, there is an agency there. And sometimes, as Drew pointed out, you need to know what is the purpose of the assessment to actually meet the assessments. Like in Drew's class, for example, okay, I need to pass this class. What are the strategies? And you can work together with your classmates, or you can decide which qualities are actually important or relevant for you. In terms of the government, there is actually one question who asked, like, what can the government do about it? Well, change the assessment, I would say. And I actually was contacted by one of the experts in this asking like, oh yes, the Indonesian government is in the process of amending the law on teachers. This is, behind the scene information. I don't know how it goes. They asked me. I don't know whether it still stick to the checklist type or it will be holistic. But I think the government is doing something, which is really great. The school, it really depends. In terms of school, different school, of course, require different thing, you know. There are quite a number of questions saying that, okay, but what can we do as a teacher when there is a gap of technology knowledge? Now this is pandemic, every teacher are forced to actually have that qualities of being able to apply technology in teaching. But again, you are the teacher, you understand your learning context and environment, and you can decide actually the level of technology that you want. It doesn't have to be the high advanced technology. You can also use low level technology. What matters is, and I think this is something that some teachers keep forgetting, is that learning objectives, the potential learning objectives is more important than the tools you're using. You can use any tools, but it's always the learning objectives. So yes, I understand that there are quite a number of frustration among teachers, and that's why it's interesting to actually do research about this. I have received warnings from people that say that my research result might be an attack to the government, an attack to the school, but that's a reality. That's a reality. I mean, there are other forces of nature that as a teacher you need to serve. And well, what can I say? There are 22 questions in the question and answer, by the way.
I've been doing my best to answer some by typing while you've been talking, Nenny, and I've answered a couple, but obviously it's a shame that there's impossible to answer them all. Yeah. I'm just reading up now. I see it's a question. I mean, thank you for all your comments, by the way. It's great to have the feedback. It makes it seem like you're real people rather than just names on a screen. Lydia Agata says, wouldn't it be one of the ways for us to supervise the development of the students? Verbalized feedback is very important. I agree, Lydia, and I guess this is what I was talking about. The important thing, I talk about it in depth today, but this idea of surveillance, it works both ways. It is important that the teacher keeps an eye on the students, and there is this sense of power and surveillance in that respect. And sometimes students, they don't want to be monitored. But of course, you want something from your teacher. If my job was just to mark these guys at the end of the course, then they would rightly see me as a quite different kind of authority from the authority of the teacher. A kind of active role from your teachers, and so giving feedback is obviously that important role. But just the trouble is that we don't always set up our assessments in ways that really allow this feedback to be given, except at the end of the course. It's too typical, I think, of many university settings that the first time you get feedback is at the end.
Okay, it is very interesting to listen to your explanation, but I'm afraid we are approaching the end of the session, and we still have one session. This is a live question and answer session. But before, let me inform you that the exit poll is now being launched. So please make sure that you complete the exit ticket to get your e-certificate. Okay, while collecting your e-certificate, I would like to invite one participant to have or to address his or her question and to be answered by Ibu Neni and Andrew. This is a live question and answer session. So please raise your hand. Yeah. I saw here Ibu Nani, Kairani. Ibu Nani, time is yours. Please mention your affiliation and then briefly address your question.
Okay, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear my voice?
Yes, sure.
Is it clear?
Yeah, it is clear.
Thank you. My name is Nani Hairani. I'm an English teacher of senior high school in Jakarta. It's 44 senior high school. Actually, this is kind of very new material for me. But I'm really interested, especially Bu Neni, because this is several meetings that I've been with her. I'm interested in having language research actually, since the government also give us like a must for teachers to have research. So I sent you my question on the question and answer actually. Can you please tell us about, tell me especially and tell us any community for a beginner for language research, especially English research in Indonesia especially, or probably or also in other countries that we can join through some media, especially online. That would be very helpful for us. Thank you.
Can I answer? Unfortunately, Bunani, I don't know. Seriously, I don't know any. I think I'm in a very hermit mode. I don't really follow, but there are some professional development page in Facebook that you can follow. I literally don't know. I don't know about Drew. I don't know any community out there that for early researcher. But I think the best way to start is by throwing this idea among yourself. You know, like if you don't know any community, create the community. That's always my approach. Because sometimes it's when you search it, if you cannot find it, develop it. It's always useful to have people whom you know and you discuss. And this is something that many times I feel that Indonesians don't really enjoy having intellectual discussion among colleagues. So when you are talking in a common room, for example, among your colleagues, the conversation becomes very personal, like how are your kids, how are your day, or you complain about your student, but you don't actually talk about some questions that you can use to create solution for the problem. Okay, so I suggest if you can talk in the common room of your school, instead of complaining about your students, venting your feeling about your students and why your students behave such and such. Okay, you can start by discussing it with your own colleagues, like, okay, why the students can be really troublesome? What actually takes it? Why my way of teaching is not really effective? I want it this way. Can you share about that? Create your own community of practice. Just like what Drew said about Wengerian perspective of community of practice. It might be useful just talking to your own colleagues. I think that would be.
I see here there are some other participants who want to have a live question and answer session, but I'm afraid that the time it is about time to end the session. So I think I need to end the question and answer session now. So thank you very much, Drew and Ibu Neni, for the very inspiring talk. And I think this is very important for us to remind us about our employable teacher professional identities. And I think the participants also get a very insightful answer, and we will go back home and try to improve our professional development as a teacher. Okay, and I would like to remind you again about the exit poll. So please make sure that you complete the exit poll so you will get the e-certificate. And I would like to announce the next session of this webinar series. You can see here. This is the next webinar session. And about this one, MOOCs and VR. I think this is very interesting. So please mark the calendar, mark the date on your calendar, and make sure that you won't miss this session. And about the materials and the video of the first session of this webinar series, you can also get them in our website. This one is our website. So you can get the materials, the PowerPoint slides, the video of the first session and this session here. Okay. Okay. So this is the end of this session. Again, on behalf of the English Language Education Department, the Faculty of Language and Art, Universitas Kristen Satyawacana, I would like to thank Drew and Ibu Neni for sharing with us, and also thank you the participants for joining us, and thank you for participating in this webinar, and we'll see you in the next webinar session. So bye-bye.
Yes, thank you for having me, everybody. And, you know, it's been fun to talk to you. So I've enjoyed it. So thank you for coming.